The morning started the way it always did. 6:15. The alarm didn't go off because Ethan Cole had already been awake for 20 minutes, lying on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling of a bedroom that still had crayon marks on the baseboards from 2 years ago. He hadn't painted over them. He kept meaning to. He never did. He sat up slowly, swung his feet onto the hardwood floor, and listened. Across the hall, behind the door with the paper sunflowers taped to it, he could hear the small, restless sounds of a 6-year-old beginning to stir. A creak, a soft murmur, then silence again. He had maybe 12 minutes. He moved through the apartment with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned, through sheer necessity, to compress entire mornings into fractions. Coffee, 1 cup, black. Standing at the counter. Shirt ironed the night before. Jacket from the closet. He checked himself in the narrow mirror by the front door. The suit was not new. The cuffs were fine. The collar sat flat. That was enough. He heard the shuffle of small feet before the door opened. Dad. Ruby stood in the hallway in her pajamas with the rabbits on them, her hair a dark tangle, holding the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2. She was 6 now, going on 40, according to his mother. She had his eyes dark brown, serious, taking in everything, and her mother's instinct to never ask for something without first assessing whether it was available. "Morning, Rube. Is it a suit day?" "It's a suit day." She processed this, then nodded. "Can I have the blueberry ones?" Already on the stove. She padded past him toward the kitchen without ceremony, which was the best compliment she could give. Ethan followed, turned the flame back on under the small pan, and began the second compressed sequence of the morning. Oatmeal with blueberries. Ruby's lunch packed, and in her backpack, her hair brushed and contained in 2 approximate braids that she inspected with a critical eye and approved with a shrug. He walked her the 4 blocks to Whitmore Elementary. She held his hand on the crossing and let go the moment they reached the far sidewalk, because she was 6 and 6-year-olds maintained certain dignities in public. He understood this without needing it, explained. At the gate, she turned back once. "Dad, you look good." "Yeah? The suit makes you look like a principal. Principals don't negotiate infrastructure licensing agreements." She considered this. What do they do? Mostly talk loudly about lunch behavior. She giggled a short, bright sound, gone as fast as it arrived, and disappeared into the crowd of children streaming through the gate. He stood at the iron railing for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he walked back to where his car was parked, started the engine, and pulled onto the route to the financial district. The radio played something without lyrics. Outside the window, the city moved with its usual early morning logic, unhurried and indifferent. He had 3 hours before the meeting. He used the drive to run through the contract one more time in his head, not the language. He had the language memorized, but the architecture of it, the structure of what was being proposed, and the one specific clause that had been bothering him since he first read the draft on Tuesday night at the kitchen table after Ruby was asleep. It was buried in Section 14, subsection C, under liability allocation. Most people reading the contract would focus on the revenue terms, on the access provisions, on the exit structure. That was what the Hale Group wanted them to focus on. It was where the number lived $900 million of projected value over the acquisition period, and numbers that large had a gravitational pull that bent attention toward them. But Section 14C was where the real weight was distributed. He had marked it in the margin with a single question. Who absorbs cascade failure? No one had answered that question. That was, itself, an answer. His company, ClearPath Systems, was 6 years old. He'd built it in the 18 months after his wife left, not out of grief, exactly, though grief had been part of it, but because he'd had a daughter and no safety net, and a very specific skill set that the market had not yet recognized at the price it was worth. He'd bootstrapped. He'd hired carefully. He'd turned down 3 acquisition offers in the first 3 years because none of them valued the architecture correctly. They saw the product, not the infrastructure underneath it. What ClearPath had built, underneath everything else, was a fail-safe logic layer for distributed systems. When something went wrong in a network, not if. When ClearPath's technology was the mechanism that kept the damage contained. It was, in the most essential sense, a system that knew how to find what was broken and stop the bleeding. It was unglamorous work. It was not the kind of work that generated profiles in technology magazines or invitations to keynote conferences. It was the work that happened in the dark, in server rooms, at 2 a.m., when other people's systems were failing and the phone rang. Ethan had built it because he understood, better than most, that the most important things were usually the most invisible. He parked in the garage on Whitmore and walked the 2 blocks to the building. The lobby of Hale Capital Partners was, like most things associated with the Hale family, designed to communicate a specific message to everyone who entered it. The message was, "You are smaller than this building, and the building knows it." He went through security, collected his visitor badge, and rode the elevator to the 41st floor. He was 7 minutes early. He sat in the waiting area and drank the water they brought him and looked out the window at the city below. 3 hours from now, he thought, I'll be back at my desk. He did not think about the $900 million. The Hale family had been wealthy for 3 generations, which meant they had moved past the part where money felt like something you had earned, and arrived at the part where it felt like something you simply were. Gerald Hale, 71, had inherited the capital management firm from his father and tripled it over 40 years through a combination of genuine investment acumen, relentless social positioning, and an absolute refusal to tolerate ambiguity. He wore his suits custom from a tailor in London. He referred to all technology companies as tech shops in the same tone one might use for bodegas. He had built his reputation in an era when the most important thing about a person was who introduced you to them, and had never entirely revised this framework, even as the world had shifted toward a different measure of value. He was not, by any useful definition, a bad man. He was simply a man whose map had been drawn in a different century, and who had not found occasion to redraw it. His son, Preston Hale, 43, was the operational face of the family's newer investments, the infrastructure acquisitions, the licensing agreements, the deals that were meant to modernize the family's portfolio, without requiring Gerald to understand what a distributed architecture actually was. Preston had an MBA from a school that mattered, and a habit of saying at the end of the day, at the beginning of sentences, which Ethan had noticed made his own jaw tighten slightly every time. And then there was Victoria Hale, 37, head of strategic development. She had studied economics at Stanford and worked 3 years at a consulting firm before her father summoned her back into the family structure, where she'd operated with the cold efficiency of someone who had decided, at some point in her late 20s, that warmth was a liability. She was excellent at her job. She was also the reason the ClearPath acquisition had moved from a preliminary conversation to a $900 million proposition, because she had been the only person in the family who had correctly identified what ClearPath's infrastructure layer was actually worth. This was, perhaps, her central contradiction. She understood the value of what Ethan had built better than anyone in her family, and she had nonetheless allowed her family to treat him the way they were about to treat him. She was already in the conference room when the assistant showed Ethan in. She was standing at the window with her arms crossed, speaking into her phone in a low voice. She glanced at him when he entered, and the glance was brief and without expression, the way you might note the arrival of a document you were expecting. Gerald was at the table. Preston was next to him, reviewing something on a tablet. There were 2 other men Ethan didn't recognize legal, most likely, from the way they held their pens. No one stood. Gerald looked up. He took in Ethan the way a man of his generation and disposition took in most things. As a rapid assessment, sorted into a category, filed. Ethan watched the filing happen. He had seen it before, enough times to recognize exactly when it occurred. The suit, the age, the absence of an entourage. Gerald settled back in his chair. Mr. Cole, Mr. Hale, sit down, not an invitation. An instruction. Ethan sat. He placed his folder on the table, a physical folder, not a tablet. Because he had learned that physical documents in rooms like this carried a different kind of weight, and folded his hands on top of it. Preston leaned over to Gerald and said something at a volume calibrated to be audible. Ethan caught the words "young and alone," and a brief exhalation that was not quite a laugh. He let it pass. Victoria had ended her call. She took the seat across from Ethan, opened her own folder, and arranged her pen beside it with the precision of someone performing a ritual. She did not look at him directly. The meeting began. For the first 40 minutes, it was a contract meeting. Gerald's attorneys walked through the terms. Preston added commentary at intervals, mostly regarding leverage ratios and market positioning topics he clearly understood in theory and somewhat less clearly in practice. Victoria was quiet, tracking the discussion with the concentrated attention of someone listening for something specific. Ethan listened. He asked 2 clarifying questions. He noted the answers. He did not write anything down, because he remembered what he needed to remember. It was at the 50-minute mark that the terms shifted. It was Preston who introduced the new clause, with the casual confidence of a man who had spent his entire life in rooms where he held the power. He described it as a standard protective provision, an indemnification structure that, in plain terms, meant that if the integrated system failed within the first 3 years of the acquisition, ClearPath absorbed the financial liability for cascade damage across Hale's entire portfolio of connected infrastructure. He said it the way you might say the train leaves at 4. Ethan looked at the clause. He had already read it. Of course, it was the clause that had been added to the revised draft sent over Wednesday morning, after the preliminary meeting the week before. He had noted it then. He was noting it again now, with Preston watching him with the particular expression of a man who expected the other person to say nothing, because the other person needed this deal. This provision, Ethan said, places operational liability for infrastructure I don't control onto my company's balance sheet. It's standard in acquisitions of this scale, Preston said. Legal will tell you. One of the attorneys nodded. I'm sure they will, Ethan said. He turned a page. Can I ask what's the current failure rate on your legacy integration stack? A brief silence. Our systems are industry standard, Preston said. I know what your systems are, Ethan said. I built 3 of the fail-safe protocols currently running in your Eastern cluster. 2 of them are 4 years old. I've flagged the input handling vulnerabilities twice in pre-acquisition correspondence. He said this without inflection. Not as an accusation. As a statement of verifiable fact. The way you might read a weather report. Gerald looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at Ethan. Preston cleared his throat. At the end of the day, the terms represent a reasonable, if your Eastern cluster fails, Ethan said, it doesn't fail alone. It's connected to 7 downstream systems. The cascade risk in the event of a primary failure is in the range of 3 to 400 million in operational losses inside 72 hours. He let that number sit. Under this provision, he continued, my company, which has 17 employees, would be contractually responsible for damage generated by a system we do not operate, that has known vulnerabilities I have already identified and flagged, and that your team has not acted on. The room was quiet. Gerald, for the first time, seemed to be actually listening. Preston said, I think what you're describing is a very conservative reading of the. I'd like to know, Ethan said, with the same flat evenness he had maintained since he sat down. Who bears responsibility if the system fails? He looked at Preston, then at Gerald, then at the attorneys. No one answered. Something shifted in the room. It was not dramatic. It was the quality of the silence that changed from the comfortable silence of people waiting for the smaller party to agree to a different kind of silence, the kind that follows a question no one prepared for. Victoria uncapped her pen and recapped it. Preston said, I think we can have our legal team review the. Ethan closed his folder. He did it quietly. The sound it made was very small. Then he aligned it with the edge of the table. He stood up. I won't be signing this agreement, he said. He picked up his folder. He thanked the attorneys for their time. He nodded. Once. At Gerald, the acknowledgement of an equal, not a supplicant. He did not look at Preston. He looked, for 1 second, at Victoria. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not quite surprise, not quite something else. Something in between that she shuddered quickly, the way you'd close a window against rain. He walked to the door. He opened it himself, because no one moved to open it for him. He walked to the elevator. He pressed the button. He rode down 41 floors in silence. watching the numbers descend. In the lobby, he handed back his visitor badge. The security guard said, "Have a good one." "You too," Ethan said. He walked out into the air and sunlight and noise of the street. And he felt not relief, exactly, but the particular steadiness of a man who has just done the only thing he could do, and known, doing it, that it was right. By noon, the industry channels had the outline of it. Not the details, he hadn't said anything to anyone but enough. A source at Hale, probably one of the legal associates looking to generate social capital, had described the meeting in terms that were unflattering to Ethan and carefully omitted the specific reasoning. What circulated was the shape of it. ClearPath's CEO had walked away from a $900 million deal. The interpretations were predictable. One business news outlet ran a brief item under the headline "Sources. ClearPath founder rejects Hale acquisition, reasons unclear." A trade publication picked it up and added the word "mysterious." A financial newsletter referred to him as the young CEO and noted, without evident purpose, that he was a single father. At ClearPath's offices on the 4th floor of a building in the Garfield district, a building that did not have a lobby designed to communicate anyone's importance, just a front desk with a plant that Marcus, the operations lead, insisted on watering himself. Ethan sat at his desk and worked through the afternoon. He had 3 calls: his CFO, Claire, who listened to his account of the morning without interrupting and then said, "Okay, so we're rebuilding the pipeline from the Waverly deal and the government contracts." His legal counsel, who confirmed everything Ethan had already concluded about the liability provision and his daughter's school, because Ruby had reported a stomachache at 2 p.m. that turned out to be the result of eating her lunch before first period and being hungry by noon. He left the office at 4:30, which was earlier than usual. In the Hale Capitol building, the afternoon had been considerably less orderly. It began at 1:47 p.m., when the monitoring system on the eastern cluster, the one Ethan had flagged twice in pre-acquisition correspondence, registered an anomalous input pattern in the 3rd-layer processing queue. The on-duty infrastructure team logged it as a low-priority alert. This was understandable. The alerts from that cluster generated approximately 40 minor flags per week, and the vast majority resolved themselves within the hour. At 2:23 p.m., the anomaly had not resolved. It had, instead, propagated laterally to the adjacent processing queue through an input handling pathway that had never been properly isolated. A structural gap that Ethan had identified and documented 18 months earlier, when Hale had briefly engaged ClearPath for a preliminary systems audit before the acquisition conversation began. At 3:10 p.m., the 3rd-layer queue failed. At 3:14 p.m., the cascade began. It moved the way cascade failures always move, not explosively, but with a quiet, spreading inevitability. Like water finding cracks in a foundation. The team on duty escalated to the senior infrastructure lead, who escalated to the department head, who called Preston, who was in a car to the airport for a flight he subsequently canceled. By 4 p.m., 4 of the 7 downstream systems were operating at degraded capacity. By 5 p.m., 2 had gone offline entirely. Transactions that should have cleared in milliseconds were hanging in queue. Client calls were coming in. Someone on the trading desk was using language that could not be repeated in polite company. In the war room on the 38th floor, which was, unlike what its name suggested, a very ordinary conference room with a lot of laptops and a great deal of ambient anxiety, no dramatic displays on the wall, no commanding architecture, just folding chairs and the smell of cold coffee, Victoria Hale stood at the head of the table with her arms crossed and listened to the technical team explain what had failed and how and why they hadn't seen it coming. She listened with the patience of someone who already knew the answer and was waiting only for the others to finish arriving at it. She already knew why they hadn't seen it coming. She had read Ethan's flag documentation, both times he had sent it. She had forwarded it to the infrastructure team with a note that said, "Review and advise." The team had reviewed, they had not advised, because the advisement would have required acknowledging that their legacy stack had a structural vulnerability, which would have complicated the acquisition valuation, which was a conversation no one in the building had been eager to initiate. She stood in the war room and felt, underneath the controlled surface of her expression, the specific texture of having been right in a way she did not want to have been. Preston was on the phone in the corner. She could hear him saying things that were not solutions. Her father was somewhere on the floor above, being briefed by someone who was also not providing solutions. Victoria picked up her phone and pulled up the pre-acquisition correspondence folder. She read Ethan Cole's second flagged memo, the one from 14 months ago, the one with the detailed technical analysis carefully, from beginning to end. She had read it when he sent it. She was reading it again now with a different quality of attention, not the attention of a strategist assessing deal risk, but the attention of someone trying to understand exactly what she was looking at. The memo was precise. It was thorough. It was, she recognized now without any ambiguity, correct in every particular. She lowered her phone. Across the room, one of the technical leads was explaining to Preston that they needed to bring in an outside contractor to stabilize the cascading failure. Preston was asking why their internal team couldn't handle it. The technical lead was explaining why in terms that were both technically accurate and visibly exhausting. Victoria walked to the window. Below, the city moved through its late afternoon rhythms, cabs and pedestrians and delivery trucks, all of it unhurried, indifferent to what was happening on the 38th floor of this building. She had made a calculation 9 months ago when she first identified ClearPath as an acquisition target. The calculation was, Ethan Cole's technology is undervalued, his company is underleveraged, and his personal circumstances, single father, no investor backing, limited runway for extended negotiation mean he will, when faced with a sufficient offer, sign. It had been a sound calculation, strategically. It had accounted for the market correctly. It had even accounted for Ethan's technical capabilities correctly, in the sense that she'd understood what she was acquiring. What it had not accounted for was this: that the reason he'd built something this good, this carefully, this durably, was not because he was underfunded and needed an exit. It was because he was the kind of person who built things to last. And people who built things to last did not sign contracts that made them responsible for someone else's failures. She had known that this morning, some part of her. Watching him close that folder and stand up, she picked up her phone again. She did not call her father. She did not call Preston. She stood at the window of the war room, watching the technical team work, and she dialed a number she had from the acquisition file. It rang 4 times. Then, Cole, she said, "Mr. Cole, this is Victoria Hale." A pause. "I know," he said. What most people didn't know about Ethan Cole, because most people who met him in conference rooms with 9-figure numbers on the table did not think to ask about the years before the conference rooms, was that he had built the core fail-safe architecture currently running inside Hale, Capital's Eastern Cluster. Not for Hale. He hadn't worked for Hale. He had built it 7 years ago, as a contract engineer for a firm called Anchor Bridge Technologies, which had since been acquired by a mid-tier infrastructure company, which had itself been acquired by one of Hale's subsidiaries in a 2019 deal that was too small to generate press. The architecture had passed through 2 acquisitions without anyone examining it closely enough to understand what it actually was or who had built it. Ethan had figured this out during the preliminary audit 18 months ago, when Hale first engaged ClearPath. He hadn't announced it. It wasn't relevant to the audit. He had simply noted it, confirmed it, and then proceeded to identify with the particular clarity of someone who knows exactly how a thing was built, the input handling gap that the current infrastructure team had never found. He had flagged it twice because he thought it was the right thing to do. He had not expected them to act on it. This was not cynicism. It was pattern recognition. Large organizations with legacy systems and active acquisition pipelines did not, as a general rule, initiate structural vulnerability remediation in the middle of valuation negotiations. The incentives ran the other way. You didn't highlight a problem in an asset you were pricing to sell. He understood this. He had flagged it anyway, because the failure, if it came, would not be contained to Hale's balance sheet. He had been home for 40 minutes when Victoria called. Ruby was at the kitchen table with her homework. Working through a math worksheet with the focused intensity she brought to things she hadn't yet decided were easy. Ethan was making dinner pasta. Simple. The kind that could be assembled while talking on the phone. The Eastern cluster is failing, Victoria said. I know. He had seen the industry monitoring alerts at 4 p.m. The cascade is propagating through the input handling pathway. A brief pause. The one you identified. Yes. Another pause. When she spoke again, something in her voice had changed, not softened, exactly. But something structural in it had shifted. The way a building settles when a support wall is removed. I need to ask you something. You can ask. Is there a stabilization pathway that doesn't require a full system rebuild? He had been thinking about this since the monitoring alerts. He had been thinking about it in the particular way he thought about technical problems, not with urgency, because urgency was not useful, but with the methodical attention of someone walking the perimeter of a thing, looking at it from every angle. Yes, he said. Can you? She stopped. Started again. I'm not calling to reopen the acquisition conversation. I know. I'm asking if you're willing to help stabilize the system. As a separate engagement. On whatever terms you name. He turned down the flame under the pasta. Across the kitchen, Ruby erased something on her worksheet and blew the eraser dust off the paper in a small, careful breath. I'll call you back in an hour, he said. He hung up. Ruby looked up. Who was that? Work. Is it the suit day people? Yes. She considered this. Are they in trouble? He looked at his daughter, her dark eyes, serious, taking in everything, reading him with the accuracy she'd always had, even as a baby, as if she could see the shape of whatever he was thinking before he said it. Yeah, he said. They are. She nodded. Are you going to help them? He was quiet for a moment. Probably, he said. She went back to her worksheet. Victoria Hale arrived at his apartment at 7:30 that evening. He had not expected her to come in person. He had expected a call, or perhaps a representative from the family's legal team, or some intermediate layer of communication appropriate to the distance between a person of her position and a person of his. He had given her the address when she called back, thinking she would send someone. She came herself. He was in the kitchen washing dishes when the buzzer rang. Ruby was on the couch with a book, the illustrated kind, about a family of raccoons who kept solving neighborhood problems, which she had recently declared her favorite, and which she had read 6 times in the past 2 weeks. Ethan buzzed the door open. He heard the elevator. He heard the knock. He opened the door. Victoria Hale was standing in the hallway in a coat that was very obviously expensive, holding a leather portfolio, and looking for the first time since he'd encountered her in any context, as if she was not entirely certain what she was supposed to do next. Come in, he said. She stepped inside. She looked at the apartment, not with disdain, he thought, but with a quality of observation that was trying to recalibrate something. The apartment was small, clean, books stacked on the shelf by the door, Ruby's drawings tacked to the wall beside the kitchen, a sequence of crayon portraits of the two of them, labeled in her printing. Me and Dad, Dad fixing the bike. Me and Dad at the park. Dad. Ruby looked up from the couch. Who's this? This is Miss Hale, Ethan said. She's here to talk about work. Ruby looked at Victoria with the unflinching assessment children give to adults they haven't yet categorized. You're wearing a lot of coat, she said. Victoria blinked. Yes, it's cold outside. It's not that cold, Ruby said, and returned to her raccoons. Something moved across Victoria's face. It wasn't quite a smile. It was something more involuntary than that, the kind of thing that happens before you can manage it. Ethan gestured toward the kitchen table, which he had cleared. He poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and set one in front of her. She sat. She opened her portfolio. She had printed the monitoring data, the cascade timeline, the system failure map, the projected losses. He looked at it. He had already modeled most of it. Current losses are in the range of 240 million, she said. At current propagation rate, we're looking at another 120 million in the next 18 hours, if the input pathway isn't isolated. I know. Can you isolate it remotely? No. I'd need access to the primary system environment. We can give you access, not remote access, he said. I'd need to be on site. A pause. Tonight? Tomorrow morning. 6 a.m. If I'm there by 6, I can have the pathway isolated before market open. The propagation slows overnight. The downstream traffic load drops significantly between 2 and 6 a.m. She looked at him. How long have you known this was going to fail? He considered the question carefully. I knew it could fail, he said. I identified the structural gap. I didn't know when or whether your team would address it before it became critical. They didn't. No. Silence. She looked down at the monitoring data. I read your memos again, she said. Both of them. He waited. You were thorough, she said. More thorough than you needed to be for an audit engagement. I was thorough because the failure risk was real. I know. She closed the portfolio. She looked at him directly, the first time, he realized. She had looked at him directly since they'd met, without the mediation of some strategic calculation running underneath. I forwarded your findings to the infrastructure team. I want you to know that. I know. I saw the routing on the second memo. She absorbed this. They didn't act on it. No. That's my failure, she said. It was not an apology. It was a statement clean, undecorated. The kind of admission you make when you've already moved past the part where admitting something is difficult. I should have pressed harder. He nodded once. From the living room, the sound of Ruby turning a page. What do you want? Victoria asked. For the engagement. Name the terms. He had thought about this during the hour between her call and her arrival. He had thought about it methodically. The way he thought about technical problems. Perimeter, angles, structure. I want 2 things, he said. They're not negotiable as a set. Tell me, first. A consulting agreement that compensates ClearPath at market rate for the remediation work. Not a percentage of saved losses. Market rate for the hours and expertise. I'll have Claire send you the rate schedule. That's reasonable. Second, he looked at her. A written acknowledgement, he said, that the technical vulnerabilities were identified and flagged in advance. Dated documentation. Not for litigation. For record. For my company's due diligence file. She was quiet for a moment. You want to protect yourself, she said. I want the record to be accurate. He said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she picked up her pen. Send me the rate schedule, she said. I'll have the acknowledgement document drafted tonight. He nodded. She started to stand. Then she stopped. Mr. Cole, she said. My family was. She paused, recalibrated. The comments made in the meeting this morning, they were inappropriate. He waited. I didn't correct them, she said. I should have. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. You should have. It landed. He could see it land. She held his gaze and did not look away. I know, she said. He was at the Hale Capitol building at 5:47 a.m. He had dropped Ruby at his neighbor Janet's apartment. Janet was 71, retired, and had an open-door policy for Ruby that she described as mutually beneficial. She keeps me young and I keep her in oatmeal cookies. Ruby had shuffled in half asleep with her backpack and her elephant, and pressed her face briefly against Ethan's shoulder. Will you fix it? She'd asked. Yes. Okay. She'd gone inside. That was that. Victoria met him in the lobby. She was in a suit that was clearly not yesterday's, which meant she hadn't gone home, which meant she'd been in the building all night. He noted this without comment. She led him to the infrastructure level on the 22nd floor, past the security door, into the server environment. The on-duty technical team looked at him with the controlled wariness of people who know they need help from someone they'd been given no reason to trust. He understood this. He didn't perform reassurance. He sat down at the primary console, looked at the monitoring dashboard for 2 minutes, and then said, I need read access to the third-layer queue logs from the past 14 hours and write access to the input validation protocols in clusters E3 through E7. The team lead looked at Victoria. Victoria nodded. The access was granted. He worked for 3 hours and 11 minutes. He did not explain what he was doing as he did it. He did not narrate. He did not ask for validation or reassurance or appreciation from the people watching him work. When he hit a question he couldn't answer from the logs alone, he asked it cleanly, without preamble, and the answer, when given, went directly into the next action. The team watched him with the attention of professionals who recognized, with the specific discomfort of people being shown something, that they were in the presence of someone who understood the system better than they did, and did not particularly need them to acknowledge it. Occasionally, he asked a question about system architecture, about maintenance windows, about which downstream nodes were still operating at partial capacity, and the questions were answered, and he returned to the work. The rhythm of it was steady and unhurried. He did not perform urgency, he simply worked. At 9:02 a.m., the input handling pathway was isolated. The cascade stopped. The monitoring dashboard, which had been showing a slow, spreading pattern of orange and red across the system map, stabilized. The downstream systems that were still operational held their load. The two that had gone fully offline would require separate remediation. But the active failure was contained. The team lead exhaled. He looked at the dashboard. He looked at Ethan. He said, "How did you?" and then stopped. Ethan said, "Your E5 cluster was running an input validation protocol from 2019. It was written before the integration with the downstream payment processing node. When the third layer started failing, E5 couldn't distinguish between malformed inputs and legitimate high-volume traffic, so it passed everything through. That's where the cascade found its pathway." The team lead was quiet for a moment. "We ran a full audit in 2022. Your audit checked functionality," Ethan said. "It didn't check the integration boundary assumptions." He said this without judgment, different kind of review. He stood up. He handed back the access credentials. Victoria was standing at the edge of the room. She had been there for the last hour, not speaking, watching. He walked toward the door. "Cole," she said. He stopped. "You could have," she said, and paused. "Started again. You didn't have to be thorough. You could have isolated the immediate failure and left the boundary issue unflagged. You'd have still fulfilled the engagement terms." He looked at her. "I know. Why didn't you?" He thought about how to answer this. He was not a man who did not know what he thought. He was a man who considered whether to say it. "Because the boundary issue will cause the same failure in 8 months, he said. "Maybe 12. Different trigger. Same pathway. That's not your problem." "No," he said. "But it will be someone's problem. Probably more than one someone's." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll make sure the team reviews the full boundary documentation," she said. "I left it in the notes file," he said, time-stamped. He went back to the elevator. 3 weeks later, Victoria Hale published a statement. It was in a trade publication that covered enterprise infrastructure, not the kind of publication that reached many people, but the kind that reached the right people. The statement acknowledged that Hale Capital had engaged ClearPath Systems for a systems remediation engagement following an infrastructure failure in late spring. It noted that the failure mode had been identified and flagged in advance by ClearPath in the pre-acquisition audit process, and that the company's founder had provided a thorough and professional remediation under difficult circumstances. It did not mention the meeting. It did not mention Preston's comments, or Gerald's, or the particular quality of the silence when Ethan had walked in that day in his non-new suit with no entourage. It did not need to. The people who needed to read between those lines would read between them. Ethan read the statement at his desk on a Tuesday afternoon. He read it once, noted it, filed it in the ClearPath records alongside the written acknowledgement Victoria had drafted the night she came to his apartment, and returned to the proposal he was working on a contract with a government infrastructure agency that Claire had flagged as a strong fit for ClearPath's capabilities, at a value that was, while not $900 million, real and workable, and built on terms he had written himself. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Victoria Hale. He answered. "Cole, did you see it?" she asked. "Yes. It's accurate?" "It's accurate." A pause. "Good. Then, my father read it." "What did he say?" "He asked me who had written the pre-acquisition flag memos." "What did you tell him?" "I told him the same man who fixed the system." A pause, that had a different quality than the others. He didn't say anything after that. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Miss Hale," he said. "Victoria. Victoria." He looked out his office window at the street below, the ordinary, mundane, grinding movement of a Tuesday afternoon in a city going about its business. "The acknowledgement document is filed. The engagement is settled. What else do you need from me?" She was quiet. "Nothing," she said. "I wanted to make sure you saw the statement." "I did." "Okay," she said. And then, with the directness of someone who had decided to say a thing precisely once and not repeat it, "For what it's worth, and I know it may not be worth much, given the morning, I thought you were right. I thought you were right, and I didn't say so, and I should have." He held the phone. "It's worth something," he said. That was all. He had not become rich from the Hale engagement. He had not become famous. He had not been featured in a profile. He had not received an apology from Gerald Hale or from Preston, and he had not expected one. Preston's comments in the meeting lived in his memory the way minor rudeness often does not with heat, because heat required ongoing attention, but as a data point about the kind of room that had been, and the kind of room he would not enter again on those terms. He did not become rich from the Hale engagement. The consulting rate was fair. ClearPath had charged what the work was worth, and Hale had paid it without disputing the invoice, which was itself a form of acknowledgement, but it was not the kind of number that changed the fundamental architecture of his life. It covered 6 months of runway. It allowed him to hire one more engineer, a systems specialist named Dana, who had worked for a networking firm in Denver and had exactly the kind of boundary integration experience that the Hale work had highlighted as a gap. He did not buy a new suit. The old one was fine. Ruby turned 7 in August. They had a party with 6 children and a rectangular cake from the bakery on Clement Street with a raccoon on it, because she had decided that raccoons were her current emblematic animal, and he had learned, over 6 years of fatherhood, to take these decisions seriously. The party took place in their living room, which was too small for 6 children and their attendant noise, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched his daughter move through the controlled chaos of her own party, managing it. Somehow, with the particular competence she brought to things she cared about, and felt the specific, weighty, uncomplicated thing he always felt watching her, which had no name in the language of deal negotiations or leverage ratios or cascade risk analysis. It was not a complicated feeling. It was just very large. He took a photograph. He sent it to his mother, who had never stopped worrying about him, and probably never would, and had learned, over the years, to express her worry in forms he could receive without flinching, practical things, mostly a casserole left on his doorstep when she visited, a text asking if he'd had lunch, a card tucked into Ruby's birthday envelope with a note that said she has your eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, which is a very good combination. She sent back a row of heart symbols. He looked at the symbols for a moment, and the thing he felt was simple and did not require analysis. He went back to monitoring the party. 2 months after the Hale engagement, the government contract came through. Claire called him at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday, and her voice had the particular quality of controlled delight she deployed when something went genuinely right. "We got it," she said. "Full scope. 3-year initial term, with options." "Good," he said. "That's it? Good? It's very good, Claire." "Ethan, this is..." She paused. He could hear her trying to calibrate to his register. "This is significant." "I know it is. Are you going to do anything to celebrate?" He thought about this. "Ruby's been asking about the aquarium," he said. There was a brief silence. Then Claire laughed, a real one. "Okay," she said. The aquarium. He took Ruby to the aquarium on a Saturday in October. They spent 2 hours in the main hall, where Ruby discovered the octopus exhibit and stood in front of the tank for 12 uninterrupted minutes, which was, she informed him, because the octopus was thinking very carefully about the glass and whether to trust it. He watched her watch the octopus. She was the reason, he thought. Not the only reason, he was also the reason. Some version of himself that had decided, at some point in the years before she existed, that the thing worth doing was the thing built to last. But she was the reason it had been possible to walk away from the $900 million in that room, because his obligation, the real one, was not to a number. It was to the work, and his obligation to the work was not separate from his obligation to the small person beside him who trusted him. Every morning, in a way that was unconditional and total and demanded nothing of him except that he be the same person whether anyone was watching or not. He had been that person. He remained that person. That was the whole thing. The industry remembered the Hale meeting for about 6 months, which was about as long as the industry remembered anything that didn't end in either a spectacular success or a spectacular failure. There was a brief period when people in infrastructure circles used the phrase "a clear path clause" to refer to cascade liability provisions in acquisition agreements. The specific provision Ethan had refused to sign, but the phrase never made it out of the technical community and eventually faded back into the vocabulary of contract negotiation jargon. Preston Hale was moved, 18 months later, to an advisory role within the family structure. The shift was described internally as a strategic reconfiguration. Victoria was appointed operational head of the infrastructure portfolio. She and Ethan had 4 more professional interactions over the following 2 years, straightforward, scoped, technically precise. And in each one, she was the same person she had become in the kitchen, in his apartment. Direct, honest, without the layer of strategic performance that had been present in the conference room. He respected her for it. Gerald Hale retired at 73 and gave an interview in which he said, among other things, that the most expensive mistake you could make in the infrastructure business was failing to understand the difference between the price of a thing and the value of a thing. Ethan read this, noted it, and did not send it to anyone. He was having dinner with Ruby when he read it. She was eating pasta and explaining to him in considerable detail why the raccoon family in her current book had made a strategic error in Chapter 6, and he was listening with the full quality of attention he brought to the things that mattered. Which was all of it. Which was this. "Do you think they'll fix it?" she asked. "The raccoons." "I think they'll figure it out," he said. "How?" "They'll go back to the beginning," he said, "and look at what they missed." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "That makes sense," she said. "Then, can I have more pasta?" "Yes," he said. He passed her the bowl. Outside the window, the city moved through its evening lights, coming on in the buildings across the street, the ordinary sound of traffic, the particular quiet that settled over this street at this hour. A quiet he had come to know the way you come to know a piece of music. You've heard so many times it has stopped being background and become part of the texture of things. He had not made $900 million. He had built a company that worked because it was built honestly. He had a daughter who was currently trying to fit an improbable amount of pasta onto a fork with the focused determination of someone who believed, on principle, that improbable things were worth attempting. He had mornings. He had the quiet certainty of a man who knew exactly what he was and what he'd built and why it had lasted. That was not a small thing. It was, he thought. Watching Ruby eat pasta on a Thursday evening in October. Most of the things worth counting. It was most of the things.